Good morning, everyone. I'm Ricardo Fernandez, president of Lehman College, and I would want to welcome all of you to the 46th annual Herbert H. Lehman Memorial Lecture. I want to give a special welcome to the students from the High School for American Studies. We're always happy to see you at these. You know, this lecture is one of the longest standing traditions at Lehman College. Now, in its 5th decade, this lecture is an annual event that recognizes the birthday of our namesake, the former governor of New York and United States Senator Herbert Henry Lehman. Born in 1878, Herbert Lehman was, like many of our students, the child of immigrants. And that's a fact that he never forgot. It was President John F. Kennedy who once famously noted that America was a, quote, nation of immigrants. But Herbert Lehman had been fighting for immigrants long before that statement. Herbert Lehman once said, and I quote, "It is the immigrants who brought to this land the skills of their hands and brains to make it a beacon of opportunity and hope to all men." When there were some people in the United States Senate who wanted to pass anti-immigrant legislation in the 1950s, Lehman was one of the people who led the fight against that. He voted against it. He understood that it was the sweat, toil, and devotion to this country of millions of immigrants from every corner of the globe that has made this nation what it is. Throughout his life, Herbert Lehman was a public servant. He served as lieutenant governor of the Empire State for 4 years, and then 10 years as its governor before resigning his office in 1943 to work at President Roosevelt's invitation as the first director of the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA. In that capacity, he oversaw the delivery of 24 million tons of food, clothing, and medical supplies to millions of victims of war-torn Europe. I might add that that is still the largest international relief effort in history. He was then called to serve the people of New York, once again, as their representative in the United States Senate. And it was during the 1950s when he was a beacon of light in the darkness of McCarthyism, refusing to yield to the character assassination and political witch hunts that were being mounted. It was in that chamber that Herbert Lehman became known as the conscience of the Senate. We are, I'm proud to note, the only college in the United States named after Governor Lehman, a great New Yorker and a great American. He continues to be an inspiration to all of us at the college, even now, more than 50 years after he died in December of 1963. We are very proud to bear his name, and we are also proud to embrace his ideals. I am absolutely sure that were he alive today, he would be very proud of the thousands of students who have graduated from this college, many of whom, like him, have been immigrants, or the children, or the grandchildren of immigrants. He would also be proud of the long list of distinguished guests, writers, artists, scholars, educators, leaders, public officials who have delivered the annual lecture that honors his legacy each year. Today, we add yet another name to that impressive list. Francisco Marmolejo, who is the lead tertiary education specialist for the World Bank. Mr. Marmolejo regularly speaks and writes on a wide range of tertiary education issues. He has worked as an administrator and a faculty member at a number of universities, including the University of Massachusetts Amherst, Universidad de las Américas in Puebla, in Mexico, and the University of Arizona. His international education experience has taken him to more than 60 countries around the world, where he has worked with universities, governments, and international associations on international education projects over more than 30 years. In fact, earlier today, he was telling me that he just got back from Siberia, of all places. And we had a nice conversation about the differences in university culture between the United States and Russian institutions of higher education. All I can say without getting into that discussion is that I'm very glad to be in the United States. The subject of Mr. Marmolejo's talk, towards a renewed role for higher education in a rapidly changing world, Are We Ready?, is one that we should all listen to. As I have noted before, unprecedented changes have occurred in the world in recent years. The digital revolution has upended all factors of life and industries, changing the way we live, the way we consume media, and indeed the way we learn. I can say that in my 25 years as president of Lehman College, I have not seen this much disruption and change in higher education as I have witnessed in the last decade. From a global perspective, Mr. Marmolejo will speak of the recent changes that have taken place in higher education worldwide, as well as the changes yet to come, and what they portend for the United States. It's my sincere pleasure then to introduce to you Mr. Francisco Marmolejo.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's a great honor for me being able to share with you this morning some reflections on what I see in higher education all over the world as it affects our day-to-day lives. I have the privilege of meeting President Fernandez for a number of years. I think it is important to say that he has become a real institution in the world of higher education, not only here in the United States, but also abroad. A number of years ago, when I had the privilege of being a fellow of the American Council on Education, President Fernandez was recently inaugurated as president of this institution, and for us, being fellows, he was and he is, and I'm sure he will be for a number of years, a mentor and a symbol to follow in the leadership of institutions. And having the opportunity to speak up as part of this lecture series honoring Mr. Herbert Lehman is for me also something that is extremely significant, because myself, also I'm an immigrant, and I believe that in the diverse world in which we live, this is something that should be celebrated, because at the end of the day, that's what it will make a huge difference in the future years. So I should confess to you that I was a little bit nervous before joining this session, because I know that for students coming here, it is always a little bit challenging, because especially students are very busy with many more things, and that, and also I'm aware of the fact that students' span of attention is relatively short, because you have, again, many more exciting and interesting things to think about. And especially today is a unique challenge, because among the audience is also my youngest son, Juan, which is the first time that he's going to be listening to the boring stuff that his dad talks about in different parts of the world. So I have I hope after this session I will have a decent evaluation from him about my speech. I'm originally from Mexico, So that's one of the reasons why I will ask for forgiveness to this audience, because instead of speaking in English, I will speak in Spanglish. And I hope that you may understand my conversation. So President Fernandez, when he kindly invited me to speak at this event, he asked me to share with you some of what I see that is happening in the world of higher education, and also why that will change the way that students interact with institutions today, the way that faculty members also eventually may have to take a look to a different perspectives on what is happening around us. I have the privilege of traveling many parts of the world, and I have been doing that for a number of years. And by doing that, always I exercise this capacity to observe things in other contexts as they are related to what we have in our own domestic context. And that comparative perspective allows me to see that definitively, as President Fernandez indicated, the world has changed. The world will change much more in future years, and we better be prepared for that. And that's what I'd like to talk about this morning. So, and in order to begin with, I think it is important to talk a little bit about the context. And believe it or not, the context, relevant context in the higher education, has nothing to do with higher education. We have to look at the overreaching world. We need to go beyond the boundaries that we have established in our higher education institutions in order to see what are the implications on the job of institutions. So, and the first thing that probably we need to be aware of the fact is that the world has changed. And the world has changed a lot. And it has changed a lot in recent years. I can tell you about my own experience of only a little bit more than 50 years. But in my 50 years of understanding this world, I can see that that has changed. So recently I went to visit my parents' house in Mexico. And they still have the Mapa Mundi, where I learned about the geography of the world when I was a kid. And it was interesting to see that there were some countries that didn't exist. There were some countries that existed at that time that no longer exist. Just by taking a look to the geography of the world, we can see that there has been a little bit of a change. Since President Fernandez became president of this university in 1990, to now, there are 34 more countries in the world, just in that period of time. So I wonder if for you as students, do you think that in future years there will be more countries? For sure. There will be some countries that will disappear? For sure. And you better have that sense of that world changing, because that's where you will have to be productive citizens of the future. So we live in a world which is increasingly interdependent. No longer what happens in one place stays there, because it has significant implications to other parts of the world. At the same time, we live in a world which is increasingly intercommunicated. There might be the case that probably somebody already may be making a tweet about the conversation that we are having right now, and that eventually becomes part of the cyber communication in this world. So no longer, again, what happens here stays here. It has significant implications, of course, in other parts of the world. When I was a kid, my connection to the world was a radio. And that radio still is at my parents' home in Mexico. We didn't have electricity back in those years. So we needed some batteries, like this one. Take a look to that one. That is a battery equivalent to 2 batteries that you have today in a device like this. And we were able to listen to the news only at 7 p.m. because we needed to take care of the precious battery. And we were listening to the Carta Blanca news. And that was my connection to the world. If I wanted to read the newspapers, I will have to wait 3 days in order to learn what happened 3 days before in the world. Of course, today we live in a world which is instantaneous. In fact, in reality today, students don't read the newspaper anymore. Let me ask this question. How many of you read the newspapers? The paper? I'm impressed. Let me tell you, recently I was with a number of high school students in Washington, about 200 students, and only probably about 10 of them said, I learned about the news because I read the newspapers. Most of them, what they do, how they learn about the news in the world is because they receive the Instagram and they connect to Facebook and other things, right? Is that true or not? That's what my son does. And I think he represents more or less something similar to yours. Anyways, think about the fact that your parents or your grandparents, that's the way that they learn about the news. Again, we live in a world which is completely different. It is a new reality, and it is a new reality that, we like it or not, we have to learn to see with new glasses. Otherwise, we are going to be missing the point about this dramatic transformation that the world is living today. So I will invite you this morning, for all of us collectively, to think a little bit out of the box, out of the conventional. Who told us, for instance, that the North is in the North and the South is in the South? It all depends on where we are located in order to see the world, right? So it all depends on the position that we have to see the world. And this is the invitation that I'd like to make all of you to think about the future world. Think out of the conventional. Try to see things that are not common to others, because, again, that's what the world is going to be about. Those are some of the pictures of our beautiful world, which are a little bit out of the conventional. So for many years, of course, I had think that the center of the world was my hometown, Ojuelos. This is Ojuelos, the capital of the world, in the state of Jalisco, in Mexico, right? Well, now what we are going to be doing is we are going to be a little bit indulgent to the audience, and we will consider that Lehman College is the center of the world. So we are right now in the center of the world. Where is the center of the world? Where is the North? Where is the South? Well, this is the center of the world. That is Lehman College. That's where we are right now, right? Don't forget that our beautiful planet is just a speck in the universe. That's where we are. We need to think out of the conventional. Just think about this fact. If Earth's life will be the equivalent to 24 hours, and right now will be at midnight, guess how many minutes human beings have been in this planet? What do you think? Huh? Exactly 1 second. That's the transcendence of our work, if you want. So we need to be humble in one way, but at the same time, we need to see the dimension of the world in which we live. In other words, the future is not something that eventually may happen. The future is what I do today, where I am right now, and the way that I build things that may happen in tomorrow and after tomorrow. When I was a kid, I used to read this scientific paper, which is Reader's Digest. And then in this scientific paper, one day, I found a quotable quote that stuck in my mind, and that I think for me was a transformation in a way. It says, when I think about the future, I become scared about the present. So we better think about the future, because at the end of the day is what we will build. What you are doing as students is precisely building that future that I hope is going to be better for you and for your families, as well as for the community. So in order to think about that and the impact that this has and will have in higher education and in the preparation of the future generations, of course, we need to situate ourselves in today's day. We need to think about what is going to happen in the future years, but also we need to go back a little bit to the past to see where we were before. That's the way that we can understand what are the implications of this future to the world of higher education. This is me back in 1995, when I still had, hair and less weight. This is me now. And then, of course, it is difficult to think how I will be in the year 2035 if I am around. But recently, I found an app that was able to extrapolate a little bit about my personal features to the future, and I found that, this is me in the year 2040. I should tell you that recently I was chatting with my wife, and then my wife suddenly stopped speaking, and then she looked at me like, the way that she looked at me that, very close, and then she says, "Do you remember that picture about yourself in the year 2040? And I said, "Yes." And then she said, "You better update that picture because it looks you are getting closer to that." So anyways, probably one of these days I will use a different picture to feature myself. But think about that fact. You as students today, still you have an impression of the world which is a little bit different, but think about how do you see yourself by the year 2040? At that time, how old you will be? If you try to think about where you see yourself in those years and what are the kind of things that you will have to build in order to become the individual, the persona that you want to be back in those features. This was me in the year 1981 when I finished my university studies. Of course, you don't see me. I see it. This is me. So anyways, in 1981, of course, I never imagined that years later, I will have the privilege of being in Lehman College talking about these crazy things about the future and of the world of higher education. But of course, at that time, I had very clear in my mind that I wanted to do something different. And that's the invitation that I will make to all of you. Think about the way that you will become different and you will make a difference to your community. So, and of course, that means that you will have to make different scenarios about the future. And that's the kind of thinking that we need to do about higher education. At the end of the day, of course, we need to think out of the conventional. That's what is the most sort of clear invitation to me. So in order to see what is going to happen in higher education, we eventually need to think about and to review things that happen around higher education. Let me tell you, for instance, what some organizations on education in the world are talking about. OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. OECD basically every 2 years makes an analysis about what are the issues around education that will have an implication in education. And OECD says, there is a new dynamics of globalization, new players, a new geopolitical environment in the world, new social challenges, families which are becoming different, societies that are becoming older, and youth which is in technology differently. Of course, there is a changing world of work. Up today, we believe that working is moving physically from one place to the other, and that, of course, it is changing as we see, and eventually that will have a change in education too. A transformation of childhood and families, and also the influence, as President Fernandez indicated, that technology has and will have in current and future generations. UNESCO, every 10 years, makes an analysis about significant trends in higher education, and also you can see interesting issues that 8 years ago, UNESCO predicted that will be experienced in higher education in this decade. Some of them, you can see them very visibly in cases like the United States. Massification of higher education, but still, unfortunately, asymmetrical access to higher education. Increasing international student mobility. We see that happening all over the world, and I will mention something about that later. The revolution, of course, of teaching, learning, curriculum, MOOCs, all those kind of things that we see constantly. The quality assurance becoming much more irrationalized. The whole issue of who should pay for higher education, which is becoming critical in the world. The fact that growth in higher education is happening mostly because there is a huge wave of new private institutions in the world. The academic profession, interestingly, believe it or not, this is the decade where the largest number of faculty members are going to be retiring in the world. And of course, the need to replace that wave of retirement in an adequate way. The research environment becoming much more international and competitive. And of course, finally, the influence, again, of information and communications technology. And also in the World Bank, we identify some of those challenges that we see. We have the fortune in the World Bank of having about, in the higher education area, more than 100 colleagues which are spread out all over the world. And they have an opportunity to sense what is happening in higher education, not only in the United States, but more important, in other parts of the world. So what are the issues that they observe? First of all, that there is globally a strong bias towards universities as the only place where people can have decent education. We see the challenge of limited pathways allowing mobility in between the levels of the higher education system. We see the problem of weak quality assurance, clear disparities in access, who has the privilege of getting into higher education. Some of the issues that you can see here also, of course, insufficient investment, inadequate information guiding decisions, limited adjustment on the curriculum, and of course, weak connection with innovation agenda. So as you can see, the international organizations observing higher education have some coincidences in recognizing that something is changing and that we better adapt to that in a more effective way. What we see in general is that communities at large are in a way skeptical, unconvinced, and in a way impatient about the need of higher education institutions to really respond better to things that are a little bit different. And we can see that even in the way that higher education is criticized. We see books and videos and movies even talking about the fact that there is a crisis in higher education and that, again, we better adapt in a more effective way. Those changing social and individual perceptions about higher education are something that we should pay attention to. Otherwise, we might miss the train. Otherwise, we might think that our ivory towers still will continue functioning the same way while the world is changing much more rapidly than we think about. So I think we need to think about that, again, out of the conventional, out of our ivory towers. Let me briefly refer to you about some of those trends that are around higher education. For instance, in terms of demographics, look at the world in the year 1800s and how the world keeps growing, probably much faster than we can imagine, and how the world will grow by the year 2050. So what exactly that means? Well, let me make a geography test here. So where are those countries in the world map? We know where they are, right? More or less, right? We know what language they speak. Okay, find them, please. Well, it's not easy, right? So we might have a sense of where they are. Why am I asking you about those countries? Well, for one particular reason. Because by the year 2050, in addition to the usual suspects, which is India, China, the US, look at the case of Japan, for instance. Japan here, Japan now. In addition to the usual suspects, those countries that I mentioned to you are going to be the countries with the largest population in the world. And if we don't know where they are located, if we don't know what language they speak, if we don't know the dynamics, both political, social, economic, in those countries, that means that probably we don't have a sense of what the world is going to be in the future. So the question is how we are preparing the next generations to recognize that the world in which they will live will go beyond our local community, and it will be that global village that we are talking about for a number of years. So by the year 2050, the world will be shrinking where there is fewer population, where there is the developed economies, and the world will keep growing where there are limited resources. And what are the implications that that will have in our societies and the implications that that will have in education? Let's take a case of Italy. Recently, I was in Italy, and I took this picture in Rimini that in a way reflects the demographics of Europe, and in this particular case of Italy. And today in Italy, the sales of Pampers, diapers for adults are larger than the sales of diapers for kids. And in Italy, they have the challenge of universities that have to be closed. The same is happening in Japan, Armenia. Even relatively close to here, I was chatting with President Fernandez in Puerto Rico, where in Puerto Rico, they will have to close institutions because they don't have students anymore. So we are talking about different dynamics in the world. On other parts of the world, you go to Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and the challenge there is the huge need to open more spaces for the youth, which is demanding more opportunities for education. Again, different dynamics that we need to take in consideration, because at the end of the day, that is going to be part of the challenging situation. When you become adults by the year 2050, look at the case, for instance, of countries such as Japan, where the largest share of the population are going to be retirees, which are going to be expecting that you will be working so hard to pay their pensions, and also to make sure that you will have enough money in order for you, when you retire, to have a good pension. So that is going to be the challenging world in which you will have to live. And you can see in this particular demographic pyramid that the demographics of the United States also is going to be shifting dramatically in future years. That's why my son will remember that, because when we used to take our kids to the doctor in Tucson, Arizona, she had this picture, this ad that I took a picture of, because she said, be kind to your children, remember that they will choose your retirement home. So Juan, I hope you make a good decision about the retirement home for your parents. So we, as generations, we need to take care of these particular two additional generations, because they will decide what is going to be the retirement home in which our society, when we become older, will be. The other challenge is that not only we are more, but also we live more on cities. In the year 1910, only 10% of the total population in the world live in cities. Now it is a little bit more than 50%. But it is expected by the year 2050, almost the majority of the population will live in cities in the world. And most of that growth will be in developing countries, where about 80%, as you can see here, of the world's total population, urban population, will be in those countries, not on countries like the United States. So the issue of demographics also have to do with the issue of equity. And in terms of equity, we have significant challenges to address in today's world and tomorrow's world. So on one way, we find that there is a fancy world, with all these beautiful things, but also we shouldn't forget that also, unfortunately, there are still significant inequalities in today's society. And some regions of the world are having more challenges. That's the case, for instance, of my own region, Latin America, where the sort of the equity factor is significantly challenging. And last week, I mentioned to President Fernandez that I was in Siberia, in Russia, but also I was in Lebanon. And the richest man of the world, as you know, they are competing always, Bill Gates and him, is Mr. Carlos Slim, which is from Mexico, but originally his family is from Lebanon. So I was complaining with my friends in Lebanon that Lebanon had contributed to the inequity in a country, because we have the richest man in the world, and of course that creates a challenge of how many non-rich persons exist in a country such as Mexico. So anyways, the world is changing in a way that you find the issue of inequity still very prevalent in our societies. Think about the fact that still today there are huge number of people in the world who live with just $1 per day. Just $1 per day. And of course, interestingly, you find those disparities very significant. Think about a country such as Norway, where the average income per capita is about $150 per day. But then you go to other countries such as Malawi, for instance, where that represents 3 days of salary in Norway are equivalent to 1 year of salary in a country such as Malawi. So I think those inequalities also need to be recognized, because that's part of the complexity in the world in which we will live. And poor are not only too far away. This picture you see there is right in front of the World Bank in Washington, D.C. And a friend of mine who was in Washington recently, she wrote a tweet. In fact, that's where I took this picture from, saying the World Bank is working to end poverty in the world and cannot deal with the poor people living right in front of the World Bank. And that is part of the big challenge that, of course, we face. Here in the United States, about 20% of American children and 13% of all Americans live in poverty conditions. So the poverty is a challenge not only in those remote countries that we see just in pictures, it is even here at home. And those distant realities, we need to make aware our students about it, because it is not right. And they will have an opportunity that probably we didn't, to try to address them properly. And this is the world in which they will live. And the question is how and what our higher education institutions are doing to make our students aware of this reality of the world in which they will live. How we will make sure that there is enough level of consciousness, awareness, and sense of responsibility about this world that may look so distant to them, but also is part of our today's reality as humankind. So that's the part of the challenge. And look at the case of those students which are having to struggle in order to benefit on education. Those are just some scenes of the challenge that educational access may represent to them. That's why I think we have to value what we have. And those distant realities, believe it or not, between the ones who don't have and the ones who have, many times are not very distant. Many times there is only one wall separates them, as you can see on this picture from Sao Paulo in Brazil. And in the interconnected and intercommunicated world in which we live, we can no longer ignore that. As Dominique Moissy had indicated, in today's world, poor people know how rich people live, and rich people know how poor people live. And they don't like each other's reality. And that's, again, the world in which we will live. So in international developing agencies such as the World Bank, we talk about this issue constantly, about the need to eradicate poverty in the world through shared prosperity. Because as you know, poverty means many things. It means lack of food, lack of health, lack of a house, lack of water, or lack of jobs, or eventually lack of future, and more important, lack of education. Look at this chart. Knowledge and education makes a big difference for individuals, for families, and of course, for countries. So the big challenge we have in education is how do we make sure that more people benefit from this opportunity, because we know that education is the greatest social and economic enabler that may exist. It's the greatest one. And in some parts of the world, the challenge is so huge. Look at this chart. This is the number of kids in Africa that have no opportunity of education. And this is the number of students in Africa who have the opportunity of having higher education. This is just part of the world, but you can see that repeating in other parts. So what a great privilege we have, I had, all of us here have, in having an opportunity for higher education. But the challenge is how do we make sure that others who have exactly the same right we had, but didn't have some circumstances in favor, will have that significant opportunity. Well, other element which has nothing to do with education is ecology. And the ecological factor also will have a significant role in the future of the world, and certainly the world of higher education. A number of years ago, there was a book that the older generation here may recognize, which is the book of a very interesting book, The Limits of Growth, which became a landmark book in making conscious society about the importance of the ecological elements. And look at what they did. They basically predicted that if things will continue the way at that time, by the year 2030, which is not far from now, the world will have a big ecological crisis. So recently, a number of researchers made a comparison between the original prediction and the real data in between 1970 and the year 2000. And it's interesting to see that the original prediction was not too far from what it is happening in reality. You can see here. So my hope is that this prediction that by the year 2030, the world will have a big crisis, doesn't happen. That's my hope. But of course, that requires for all of us as society to really make a difference in that particular case. And of course, the question is, what of this has to do with higher education? Absolutely nothing. In higher education, we are just talking about something else. Well, that's part of the problem. If we are teaching about something else and we are not teaching about these issues, probably we are missing the point about the diversity and the complexity, I might say, of the world in which we will live. Just in 50 years, the population of the world doubled, but also, unfortunately, the consumption of goods and services in the world went much faster than the growth of the population. It is calculated that every year, we take away from the sort of the total assets of the planet the equivalent to more or less 1 month of the capacity to replenishment. So of course we have a problem in the world, and we better make our future generations more conscious about that. And also we have to add that dimension in the learning and teaching experience of all our students. The other element that also is interesting in the world is the socio-cultural factor of the world. And we, interestingly, I was reading on my way to this conference, I was reading about the interesting diversity of the Bronx and the fact that this is probably one of the most diverse human concentrations in the United States. That's very interesting. The fact that here, I believe, a little bit more than 50% of people speak a second language, and a good number of them don't speak even English when they are kids. So it is interesting to see that happen. Well, that diversity of the world is something that also will be extremely significant, and I hope very positively significant in the future. So you are far more advanced on that particular regarding this part of the United States. So there are many ethnic and affinity groups in the world, and certainly just a little bit number of countries to contain them. And of course, that issue is going to be also very significant in the future. The need to provide good education is one of the ways that we have to take away the stereotypes, the lack of information, and the lack of understanding that we have, from each other. So that's why it is extremely important, education. If you see the problem of tolerance in our societies, there is an interesting correlation. The more you study, the less intolerant you are. The less you study, most probably the more intolerant you will be. So certainly we have a role to play in higher education institutions. And we might say, well, this is a problem of the society at large, this is a problem of the families, this is a problem of the previous levels of education. That's true. But the last place we have in our educational pipeline to make aware the students about these issues is precisely higher education. That's the last opportunity we have to tell them, celebrate diversity rather than complain about diversity. And certainly we have a big job to play here in the United States in preparing more our students about that world which is different from the stereotypes. So for instance, I'm coming from the country of tequila, as you can see. And of course, Mexicans don't drink tequila. That's not true. So you were in Mexico recently, and you can confirm that to me. We used to say that in Mexico that sorry for making this a recommendation, it is not, but Mexicans drink tequila and they say, the first drink is with water, the second is without water, and the third one is like water. So and the fourth, you lost track of that, but no, I'm not recommending that to the students for sure. So anyways, but I think we have a lot to do in making sure that our students understand that world beyond the stereotypes. We need to do a lot in order to understand that diversity in the world is something that sometimes we take it differently to what it should be. So it is very important to recognize that and making sure our students will do. So, and that means, for instance, among other things, to celebrate the opportunity of people to speak another language. So let me ask this question here. How many of the people here in the audience speak a second language, at least? Look at this. This shows precisely, the big difference of a community like this. And if we go to other parts of the United States and we ask these questions, we might find a little bit different to that. So we know that English is becoming a very significant language, and in fact, as you can see here, it is the second most important language in terms of people speaking. But by the year 2050, again, believe it or not, the second most important language in terms of number of people speaking is going to be Spanish. The first one is going to be Mandarin. And then in third level are going to be more or less, Hindi, English, and Arabic. So when I talk about the need to speak a second language, always I insist, a second, a third, and probably a fourth language, which is not bad. So you as the future generation of students have to think about that need. You probably may know that in Latin America, for instance, Spanish and Portuguese are the most significant and important languages. And guess what is the country after Mexico, the second largest Spanish-speaking country in the world? Is not Spain or Colombia, but it's the United States. That's why I like this picture that I found one day, which I don't know. Not too much to say about it. So that's why I'm working so hard in my Spanglish, trying to improve it as much as I can. So the other factor in our today's and tomorrow's society is the factor of mobility. People are moving much faster than what you can imagine. Today, there are about 200 million people in the world who were born in one country and now live in another country. Were educated in one country and probably now work in a different country. And that is growing even much faster. Even at the higher education level, you can see here the numbers of people considering the international experience as something significant as part of their preparation. It is expected that by the year 2020, about 7 million students in the world will be international students. And of course, this question results very obvious here, but let me ask this question. How many of the students which are here consider that an international preparation is and will be very important as part of your future professional success? How many of you think that? That's right. You know, the only ones who don't raise the hand are probably the ones which are probably sleeping with this boring presentation from me, okay? But if I ask a second question, here again might be an exception, but just when I see that in typical student audiences, we see the big dissonance. Because when I ask the second question is, how many of you, being very realistic, think that in your college experience, you will have that international exposure? And just a few of them raise the hand. Not all of them. So that dissonance between what they see that it will be a significant factor and what they recognize as the reality of what the college experience will provide to them, that is the area of opportunity for we as educators in providing them with something that they really need, they know they need, but they think that probably the college experience will not provide to them. There will be increased migration from one country to the other. That will continue happening. And of course, that means that when you become professionals, there will be a brutal pressure for talent in the world. There will be graying societies that are going to be needing more people with adequate preparation to work. And of course, that it will represent a significant battle, if you want, for the talent. And we are seeing that right now. There are countries that are shifting dramatically their migration policies in order to prepare to become more attractive, more beacon of attraction, while other societies, and I don't know which one I'm talking about, it looks like they are thinking exactly the opposite. They think that migration is not a good idea. That is a very nasty thing that is affecting their communities. So anyways, that's a world in which you can see those are scenes not of a science fiction movie, but those are scenes of the world of today. So the question is, what is the impact that this has and will have in higher education? Well, you know, this is a picture of a public pool in Shanghai, and of course, just think about that. So, in summary, some facts that we'll have to do is that demographics will continue playing a major role in higher education, and that higher education will continue experiencing tremendous growth in future years, but it will be an uneven growth, because in developing countries, the growth will be so dramatic, while in developed countries, the higher education systems are going to be eventually shrinking in the future years. So there will be, of course, dramatic diversification of higher education institutions. we see that right now. The emergence of multinational universities is something that is happening in many parts of the world. The portability of credentials is something that is becoming something very typical, which in a way that challenges the traditional assumption of what do we mean by a university? What is our understanding of a higher education institution? Because that is going to be, again, changing in future years. So the other factor has to do with technology, and President Fernandez made a mention to that in terms of technology. And again, in order to see the future, we need to go back a little bit to the past. And we need to think about how technology was back in the years, for instance, when we were students. And so it took 74 years for 50 million homes in the world to have a telephone, and only 4 years to have access to the internet. And again, back in those years, technology was a little bit different. When I speak with students, I ask the question, how do you think the telephones were when I was a kid? And they think that the telephones were like this one, and I said, no, we had the other telephones where you have to do this, and then somebody will answer on the other line. And I always make a mention of the fact that in my hometown, the switchboard person was my Aunt Consuelo. And my Aunt Consuelo, for whatever reason, this picture, she's not her. I just took this picture because probably that's the memory that I have of her. But the one thing that I remember well of my Tia Consuelo is that she knew everything about everybody in town. She was the most informed person that you can imagine. So, and also in order to sort of challenge the audience about this, too bad that our students already have to leave a good number of them, but I make the question about how many of them know what a slide rule is. And even though we don't have too many more high school students here, I will ask this audience, how many of you know what a slide rule is? Look at. Even here, we find about 50% of them who have no idea what it is. If the students will be here, how many of them do you think will know that what a slide rule is? Most probably none of them, right? The recent conversation that I had with students in Washington, one of them raised a hand. And I said, wow, how do you know about that? And he said, well, because my dad has one of those. And I said, well, you better take care of that because right now in eBay it costs about $800. So eventually you may make more money. So if any of you have one of that, you may think about that good investment that you made. Well, and I think it is interesting because back in our years as students, the ones who know what a slide rule is, that was the kind of calculators we had. So that was our technology. That is the kind of technology that we were prepared to use. And of course, that is completely different today. This used to be the first mouse, right? And some of you probably had to do this. I had to do when I was a student. They called the Hollery code, programming computers. That was the only computer we had at the University of San Luis Potosí. So, and I mention this because in today's world, we talk about a lot of the technology that exists today, but certainly technology changes and will change dramatically the way we live. Even the way that we communicate is completely different, right? And of course, kids in 20 years from now will laugh when kids of today talk to them about the technology that they are experiencing now. The same way kids make fun about the technology we had. I remember when Juanito was probably 6 years old, one day he asked me, Dad, what type of video games you had when you were a kid? And I said to him, sorry, my friend, we didn't have any video games. And I still remember his face, totally shocked by saying, so what a boring life you had. You didn't have video games. I said, sorry, we had a different type of games, right? Anyways, it's different. Today, 20 houses in the United States have the equivalent to all the traffic that existed in the internet in the year 1995. It's, of course, a changing world. There are more mobile devices today in the world than people. And in some countries, the number is so huge. So do we wonder if that will change the way that teaching and learning is delivered? If we don't think it is the case, we are wrong. Do we think that that will change the way that people becomes aware of information? Of course it will be. And the question is, what is going to be the role of our higher education institutions? Of course, there is a huge asymmetry in the access to technology today. There are entire parts of the world that still don't show in the map, but there is no question about the fact that technology changes and will change the world we exist, we communicate, and also we educate and become educated. And of course, with some complications, right? New limits of privacy. Yeah, and so this is the one that I like the most is this one. Yeah. So it's hard to understand what this Wi-Fi thing it is. So, and of course we see some signs of that change in, for instance, the emergence of MOOCs. And MOOCs, probably 3 years ago, it was like a big, news about the MOOCs and how they were gonna be basically destroy higher education institutions. Of course, that didn't happen. But of course, that at the same time, it is telling us something about this world that is changing. Years ago, the idea of having to get out of your enclave in order to work was seen as, you remember the Industrial Revolution. It was a major shift with this idea of people having to get out in order to work. Today, this idea of having to get out in order to have education still becomes relatively common. Is that going to be changing? For sure it will be changing. If we don't see that change, we are again eventually missing the point. So the question is, what is the impact that this will have in higher education? Well, we better take a look to that, and we better check our emails. I asked before my presentation, and I asked my son Juan, please keep my telephone and check my emails. Might be the case that I might be losing my job while I'm speaking. So anyways, so why this matters? Because our students are completely different today. And again, we as faculty members sometimes have the tendency to think of them the same way that we were students. And of course, they are dramatically different as we were today. This is what we call the M generation. They are totally immersed in the media constantly, seeing the dimension of technology and the size of the world and the size of the community completely different to what we do. They even think and act a little bit different to what we were, and sometimes with all the complications that means. He's not my son for sure. My son cautioned me before the conference. He said, "Dad, please don't say anything about me." Of course, I'm not saying anything about him. So, kids of today, students of today, are no more sequential as we were. They are multitask, and they are the way that they learn and they absorb information is completely different to the way we did. They are doing many things at the same time. They know more technology than ours. That happens at home with my kids. That happens in the classroom with your students. And they complain properly that the way we teach them is boring, is not interesting, that we miss the opportunity to provide them an enriching experience. And sometimes they might be having not precisely very positive thoughts about the educational experience and about the teachers. And of course, we shouldn't also magnify how wonderful these things, because of course there are challenges associated with the way that also they use information. It's what I call the culture of the copy-paste. And of course, that creates a challenge in terms of the superficiality, if you want, of what they are doing. And of course, they even write a completely different language that sometimes we don't understand. And they have many gadgets. And of course, we always may say that they might have those many gadgets, but differently to them, we were using the brain instead of doing all these gadgets. Those are some examples of real responses from students in different tests, in which, of course, they are very creative, especially when they didn't study. And yeah. And probably you have seen some of those too in mathematics. For me, the best one is this one. The famous Peter, he was asked to expand the mathematical expression, which he did. And then the teacher very kindly said, very funny, Peter. Yeah? So anyways, it's a new generation, and I think we better think more, with more innovative about this new generation. And again, also because this will change even more, because if you extrapolate the way that knowledge and information continue growing, that means by the year 2050, all the information that exists today in the world will be equivalent to only 1% of the information that a student will have in front of him or her in whatever device may exist at that time to which he or she will have access to when he or she will be studying in whatever university may exist at that time. So, of course, there is a big shift in this generation of being a migrant generation in technology to a native generation in technology. This is, for instance, my father with one of his grandkids, and that, for me, represents this significant change. Next academic year, 2015, all your students and Lehman College, all your students will be digital native. And of course, the way that they observe what technology is even has changed too much more than what we can imagine. So the question is, are we prepared to deal with this new generation in the different way that they consider education? I think we have a role to play on that. I almost finished. Don't worry, I have another 300 slides, and then I will finish. The economic factor is another very important, and there is a very evident connection today about the interaction between education, economic development, and social development. More than ever, we see that. On one way, we live in an economy which is increasingly global, highly interdependent, and competitive, technology-driven, constantly changing, and more, our economy is the economy of knowledge. And many studies that are conducted by a number of colleagues, and the World Bank does a lot of that analysis, show that very clearly. For instance, in terms of private returns, interestingly, a number of years ago, when we know that education represents an economic return for individuals, and the average is about 10%. 1 year of schooling represents an extra 10% of revenues as an individual in your lifespan. But if you go to the levels of education, interestingly now, the highest economic return in education is in higher education. That was not the case 20 years ago. 20 years ago, the highest return was in primary education. As a society, more and more, we can see that tertiary education is becoming the highest, enabler of economic returns to individuals. We see that in the World Bank. I was telling President Fernandez that about 10 years ago, only about 5% of the total portfolio of projects of the World Bank in education were related to higher education. Today is about 35%, and that will continue growing. Why it is growing? Because governments clearly recognize that, especially now that primary education has been achieved more or less the goal of universal access, that higher education becomes the next important wave in terms of growth for their economies as well as for individuals. And of course, just think about the fact that, for instance, in the case of Africa, 1 year increase in tertiary education represents about 12% in growth in GDP. And as you know very well, that it is not only about economic returns, but also social returns. We know that higher education is the main factor of social mobility, and we know research evidence shows that more education leads to individuals more aware of the community they live, healthier and longer lives, individuals more tolerant, and of course individuals more conscious about the environment. So we know that. What we need to do as a society is to convince others about that. And what we need to do as educators is to convince others about the fact that education is the key enabler. And I have seen that in my family. My wife and I were part of we were first generation students, as many of yours, And of course, now our kids are enjoying that benefit, and we assume that they will be able to make that possible to the next generations. So we need, in this world in which perceptions about the role of higher education are changing, we find on one way societies skeptical about the role of our institutions, but on the other way, societies hopeful about the importance of education for their kids and for the next generation. So, in summary, we need to think about a new paradigm in higher education. And that means that we recognize that the formula is very simple: more and better education. But the question is, what type of education? In the world, you can see that more people are having access to education. But unfortunately, still a few benefit from that, from a global scale. And you can see Sub-Saharan Africa, you can see the world, Latin America, and you can see the developed societies. The size of this gray area is the size of opportunity for growth in our society, but also for a better well-being. And that's where I think we have a significant responsibility to play. In some countries, still, it is very challenging. Look at my own country. If you are poor, most probably, you won't have access to education. Only 5% of those poor have access to education. If you are rich, most probably you will have access to education. So again, the size of this area is the size of opportunity for growth and better well-being. So the formula is more and better education, but the question is, what type of education? Do we want to continue teaching the same way we did? Do we want to consider that universities will not change? Do we want to consider that students will not change? Probably we might be missing the point. I do believe that the professionals of the future will be professionals that have greater capacity to adapt, to change, to reinvent themselves, even beyond the profession that they were trained for. And this is not something new. I'm sure that if I ask the question here, we will find many examples. How many of you today work in something completely different to what you were trained for, to what you study for? Look at here. We have about 50% of you. And of course, if we go out of academia and we ask the same question, most probably we will find also a greater number of people that had to reinvent themselves in order to become successful. So that was, for instance, my first job when I was a kid with my parents. I was doing that to him. I don't remember if he paid me, but anyways, I remember that because I see the picture. But some of those are professions of today, not professions of the future. And what is interesting of all of them is that, again, those are just some a few, if you want, kind of weird examples of the fact of that this is something that it will become more common in future years. So this capacity that individuals may have to combine different elements of their learning and then reinventing themselves. So that's why I believe that graduates that are required in today's world are the ones that have strong technical skills. That's very important. That's why they are coming to the university. But more important, in addition to that, individuals which are able to work in teams, individuals which are able to adapt to multicultural, enriching environments, individuals that have a good awareness of what happens in the world, but at the same time, strong sense of responsibility with the local community, individuals that speak at least a second language, who have the capacity to communicate and to properly use information and communication technology, and more important, individuals who have the capacity to continue learning for the rest of their lives. Because in the best scenario, when they graduate from Lehman College, they will be the best ones, but a day after, a good amount of the knowledge that they acquire, most probably they won't use them anymore. It will become obsolete. But if they had the curiosity to continue learning the rest of their life, for sure they will be successful professionals. That means, of course, preparing people beyond just the technique, thinking about the fact that we are preparing people. That means more humanistic preparation, more general education, and more important, that more than aptitudes, more working attitudes. I will challenge your Spanish here because Peter Drucker said years ago that in the 21st century, the ones who don't think like that probably are going to be looking for a job, are going to be on the labor market looking for a job. So, and of course, we in higher education, we need to be very serious about to recognize where we are and what are the limitations we have and what are the challenges that we need to address. So the ones complaining about higher education said that there are significant disconnects between what we teach and what employers talk about. So this analysis basically shows that. Employers basically complain that graduates of our higher education institutions are not properly adapted to what they need. But if you ask educators, most educators will say, of course, we are preparing the best people in the world. Some of the disconnects that we know exist between higher education institutions happen, of course, with the outside world, but also there are disconnects between higher education institutions and even inside the higher education institutions. When I was a student, if I will be in the School of Business and I wanted to shift to the School of Economics, the course that I was teaching in mathematics, for instance, I will have to take that course again in the School of Economics because the professors of the School of Economics thought that the only way that you can learn mathematics is in their own department, even inside the same institution. So again, I'm not sure if that happens in other parts of the world or in institutions like this, but sometimes we have that tendency to think that, there is nothing else outside. So I know that significant changes need to be happening at the government level, but also our own higher education institutions have the capacity to make some changes. And sometimes higher education institutions are relatively resistant to change. And I know that is a fact. I had worked in many universities in my life, and I had experienced that, and I'm sure that happens in different parts of the world. So the prediction from Peter Drucker saying that universities will disappear, he was wrong. Universities still exist. But at the same time, he was making the point that we have room for changes in our higher education institutions, which I hope are going to be of interest. The ones criticizing higher education say that it is the only business that holds a formal ceremony to get rid of its client, to fire its best clients. And the ones criticizing higher education say that was the Italian university in the year 1350, in which, by the way, you find somebody which is sleeping here, and that the universities of today are like that. Probably change a little bit the fancy things and then the technology and everything else, but that we are still very similar. And also that we in higher education are very good, and I remember from my previous job at the university, that we are very good in complaining about the problems by basically saying the problems come from other parts. That, students of today are pretty bad because they come totally ill-prepared from the previous levels of education. And then you go to the high school and they will complain about the secondary schools, and then at the end of the day, the guilty ones are the parents because they are the pretty bad ones, right? And of course that the ones criticizing us says that we are very good in our institutions in exercising the art of ambiguity, which is continuing doing the same things, but expecting that something else will change, right? And of course, I'm sure that it is not the case. It is an opportunity for our higher education institutions to become more flexible, more innovative, more entrepreneurial, and more internationally connected, but at the same time, better rooted into the community, and of course, more collaborative, both inside and outside. If we take away this perspective about our ivory towers and we become more tuned with what is happening outside of our institutions, most probably we will be responding better to the others. And of course, collaborating, opening up to the world is extremely important, and there are different ways to collaborate. There might be a way like this or like this. Yeah. Believe it or not, somebody told me one day, this is a penguin teaching another penguin how to swim. There's nothing wrong with that. Yeah. And of course, and everyone's contribution, it is extremely significant. Even though inside my classroom, I say, there is not too much capacity for me to change things outside. Well, there is a huge capacity. It is extremely important trying to do things even at the incremental, relatively small level. I think there is a great opportunity. In conclusion, believe it or not, I think we need to think about this change in the paradigm of our institutions in such a way that we believe that this is a good idea, but somebody else has to do it. I think we have the opportunity to try to do that, to recognize that better preparing for a new world means changing the paradigm under which we operate in our higher education institutions. It is not a priority for tomorrow. It is a priority not even for today. It was a priority for yesterday. And of course, there is no magic formula. What it might work at Lehman College may not work in other institutions, and vice versa. But I think that is the beauty of the world in which we live in higher education, in trying to make sure that there are many opportunities. Of course, the world of higher education, it is a contested terrain. There are many things that, of course, our institutions do in trying to identify what is the niche, where we are going to be different to others. And of course, as in this cartoon says, the problem is that others are exactly doing the same. So we better are extremely creative in figuring out what is precisely our own uniqueness, your own niche, and of course that is with our own institutions. As Mencken said, of course, there are easy solutions, but most of the time they are totally wrong. And I will just finish by sort of insisting that the future is not something that you extrapolate from the past or that is something that you guess using a crystal ball. The future is what we build today, what we do today in order to explain better conditions in future years. And of course, there is significant pressure for effective action. And, we can do a lot of thinking and a lot of reflection about that, but at the end of the day, we need to eat, so we need to act as soon as possible. That's a big challenge that we have to face, and this is not something new. Charles Darwin said many years ago that it is not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent, but the one that has greater capacity to adapt. Greater capacity to adapt. That's what our higher education institution need. The trouble with our times is that the future is not anymore what it used to be. Thank you very much for your patience this morning. Thank you very much.